For 15 years, I worked as a commercial diver for an oil company, inspecting and repairing offshore rigs. It was an isolated job, one that required long stretches at sea, but I loved it. There was something about being underwater, surrounded by nothing but silence and the rhythmic sound of my own breathing, that made me feel at peace. The world above faded away, and it was just me and the deep. Most of my dives were routine. I would strap into my gear, run through the safety protocols with my team, and descend into the darkness, checking welds, looking for corrosion, ensuring the structure was sound. I had done it so many times, it had become second nature. I had dived in storms and rough seas, in waters where I could barely see a foot in front of me. I had encountered sharks, massive fish, and even the occasional pod of dolphins passing through. None of it ever shook me. The ocean was vast, mysterious, but I understood it. At least, I thought I did. There was one dive, one routine, unforgettable dive, that changed everything. That day, the water was calm. Visibility was decent at the surface, the sun cutting through the waves and shimmering against the steel beams of the rig. It was just a standard inspection. Nothing unusual. I went through my pre-dive checks with my team topside, made sure my air supply was good, confirmed that my safety line was secure. A second diver stood by in case something went wrong, but nothing ever did. I was in and out in 45 minutes every time. I dropped into the water and began my descent. The first 50 feet were clear, easy. Sunlight still reached me, and I could see the rig structure stretching downwards, disappearing into the shadows below. The deeper I went, the darker it became. That was normal. I had worked in these conditions for years and knew how quickly visibility could change. I followed the still beams down, methodically moving through my checklist. Everything looked fine. No major corrosion, no structural issues. The water was still, unnervingly quiet. Even the usual small fish that hung around the rig seemed scarce that day. Then I saw it, a shadow, drifting just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, gripping the beam beside me. It was massive. Not just a school of fish or a shifting current, but something big. It moved slowly, gliding through the water with an eerie smoothness. I had seen plenty of large fish before, even sharks, but something about its shape felt different. It was deliberate, purposeful. I watched it for a moment, trying to make out more details, but then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I shook it off and continued my inspection. I had a job to do, and letting my mind play tricks on me wasn't going to help. I moved to the next section of the rig, scanning the beams, running my hands along the metal, checking for anything out of place. And then the shadow reappeared, and I saw what it was. A shark, a big one. It was easily 15, maybe 16 feet long, its massive body cutting through the water with slow, confident movements. I had seen sharks before, but this one was different. It was old, its skin scarred and marked from years of battles in the deep. I hovered in place, watching it pass. There was no fear, only admiration. Sharks weren't the mindless killers people made them out to be. If you left them alone, they'd leave you alone. They were ancient, perfect predators, rulers of the ocean in their own right. For a brief moment, I almost wish I had a camera. Then, everything changed. Something surged up from below. 1 second, the shark was there, gliding effortlessly through the water. The next, it was thrashing, its powerful body convulsing as something wrapped around it. Tentacles. Long, pale limbs covered in rows of dark, circular suckers shot up from the depths, coiling around the shark's body with terrifying speed. The shark twisted violently, fighting, its muscles flexing as it tried to escape. But it was useless. The tentacles tightened, pulling it downwards. That's when I saw what they belonged to. A squid. A giant squid. But this wasn't like any squid I had ever seen. It was too big. Its body alone was the size of a bus. Its skin an inky black that made it nearly invisible in the deep. Its tentacles stretched well beyond 100 feet, each one as thick as a man's torso, covered in suckers large enough to grip and crush bone. And then I saw the eye. A massive, unblinking alien eye, the size of a dinner plate, staring directly at me. A cold, primal terror gripped me. The shark was gone in an instant, yanked downwards in a burst of blood and bubbles. The water around me shifted, currents pulling at my body as the thing moved, as if it were adjusting its focus. I knew I had to get out. My hands found the still beam, and I climbed, kicking off the structure, propelling myself upward as fast as I could. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, the sound of it deafening in my helmet. Every instinct screamed at me not to look down. I felt the safety line tighten as my team topside started pulling me up. The water rushed past me, my heart hammering in my chest. The pressure in my ears shifted as I climbed higher, closer to the surface. I didn't stop, didn't slow. Breaking the surface felt like waking from a nightmare. The moment I was out of the water, I tore off my mask, gasping for air. My team was already at my side, pulling me onto the platform, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. I told them what I saw. They didn't question me. They knew I wasn't the kind of guy to make up stories. I had been diving for years, had seen more of the ocean than most people ever would. But this was something else. I still dive, I still work the rigs, but I've never forgotten that day, because I know now that the ocean isn't just home to sharks and fish and harmless creatures. There are things down there, things we aren't supposed to see, things that don't belong in our world, and if you're unlucky enough to encounter one, you might not make it back. Diving had always been my passion. I had spent years as a salvage diver, part of a specialized search and retrieval crew that scoured the ocean for shipwrecks, documenting history, and occasionally recovering artifacts. The idea of being the first person in centuries to lay eyes on a lost vessel, to uncover its secrets, is what I live for. And that's why I was particularly excited when my boss told us about a potential wreck near the Florida Keys. It was undocumented, untouched. If it was as old as we suspected, it could hold some serious historical significance, and maybe even treasure. The whole crew was buzzing with anticipation, but I felt it the strongest. I was part of the first dive team. I would be the first to step inside its remains. The day was perfect, the ocean was calm, the sun was bright, and everything was set for the dive. We sent a drone down first to scout the area. When we found the ship, it was clear this wasn't a modern wreck. The wooden frame was warped and broken, the remnants of its hull encrusted with centuries of marine growth. It was sitting at almost 150 feet down, a deep dive, requiring slow descent and careful decompression stops on the way up. Once we confirmed the area was safe, we suited up and descended. It took about 15 minutes to reach the ship. As I got close, I could tell right away this was older than anything I had explored before. I wasn't an expert on ship design, but from the shape of the hull and the way the beams were constructed, I guess it was from the 1600s or 1700s, possibly a Spanish galleon. Maybe even one of the treasure ships that had gone down in storms centuries ago. The wreck was fragile, its structure collapsing inward in places. I searched for a way inside, swimming carefully along the splintered frame. After a few minutes, I found an opening where the ship's bottom had broken apart, large enough to swim through. I motioned to my safety diver, signaling that I was going in. Inside, the wreck felt even older. Wooden beams, half buried in sediment, stretched like limbs across the skeletal remains of the ship. A thin layer of silt covered everything, rising in slow, curling clouds with every movement. Schools of tiny fish darted through the beams, their silvery bodies flickering in the glow of my dive light. I swam slow, careful not to disturb too much. The last thing I wanted was to stir up the silt and blind myself in an ancient tomb. As I drifted through what must have been the ship's cargo hold, I saw remnants of barrels, their contents long disintegrated. A few rusted tools lay scattered, their purpose lost to time. Near the back of the hold, a broken chest, half buried in the silt, sat with its lid rotted away. It was empty, looted long before the sea claimed their ship. Then, something caught my eye. A small glint on the floor, a flicker of gold reflecting in my light. I swam down, reaching through the soft silt. My gloved fingers brushed something hard and smooth. When I pulled it free, I felt my breath hitch. It was a coin, an old gold coin, its surface worn but still gleaming in places where time hadn't completely erased the details. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the faded markings. It was unlike any coin I'd ever seen. A sharp beeping pulled me from my thoughts. I checked my dive watch. My time was up. I needed to start my ascent if I wanted to avoid decompression sickness. Frustration simmered in my gut. I had actually found something, real treasure, and now I had to leave it behind. Regulations were strict. We weren't supposed to take anything without permits, especially from an undocumented site. It could mean huge trouble for the company. But as I looked at the coin, Something about it felt wrong, or maybe right. I couldn't explain it. It called to me, like it was mine. I hesitated, glancing at my safety diver, who was already signaling me to exit. I gave a thumbs up, pretending to follow. But before I did something I knew I shouldn't. I slipped the coin into my bag. As we maneuvered back towards the breach, I saw movement at the edge of my vision. I turned my head and nearly screamed. At the far end of the hallway stood a man. He wasn't floating. He wasn't wearing dive gear. He just stood there, motionless, his feet planted firmly on the ship's rotten planks. His clothes were old, tattered, faded, almost like a pirate's garb from centuries ago. But it was his face that chilled me. He was smiling. I blinked, and he was gone. Panic clamped around my chest. Hallucinations weren't uncommon on deep dives, but I had never experienced this before. And this just wasn't normal. I didn't care what it meant. I just needed to get out of there. We surfaced without incident. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. If I did, they'd ground me from the next dive. I wasn't going to lose my chance at exploring the wreck further over some trick of my mind. That night, I lay in my bunk, turning the coin over in my hands. It was strange, heavier than it should have been. The markings on it didn't match any Spanish coins I'd ever seen before. Then my light flickered. I looked up. The cabin went dark. And then I heard it. A wet footstep. Then another. Something was in the room with me. My hands fumbled for my lighter, my heart hammering. I flicked it on. And the man was right there. His face was inches from mine. Water dripped from his rotted skin, his grin stretched too wide. His dead eyes locked onto mine. I screamed, dropping the lighter. The door burst open as crew members rushed in. I was shaking, barely able to form words. I told them what I had seen, first in the wreck, and now in my room. The ship's doctor chalked it up to a possible mix issue with my trimix tank, a gas imbalance that could cause hallucinations. I didn't argue. I didn't want them to sideline me for the next dive. The storm hit a few hours later. It came out of nowhere. The sea turned violent, waves crashing against the ship, tossing us like a toy. The captain had no explanation. There had been no storm in the forecast. No indication of trouble at all. And then I saw him again, standing out on the deck, unmoving, staring at me. I knew in that moment what I had to do. I ran outside, clutching the coin. The storm howled around me, rain lashing in my face. The moment I reached the railing, I felt a hand grip my wrist. It was him. I looked at him. His face no longer had that grin. Now, his eyes burned with fury. I knew he wasn't letting me go. I opened my fingers. The coin slipped from my grasp, vanishing into the sea. He disappeared with it. 15 minutes later, the storm was gone. The next morning, the dive team went down again. The shipwreck was also gone. They searched for days, but it was as if it had just never been there. I learned my lesson that day. Some things are meant to stay buried. Working search and rescue as part of the dive team meant I was usually called in for one of two reasons. Either someone was trapped and needed to be saved, or someone was lost and needed to be recovered. More often than not, it was the latter. That's what I expected when we got the call about a missing diver in the Eagle's Nest cave system. The site was infamous among divers. It was vast, deep, and deceptively beautiful. The entrance made it seem easy, inviting even. But the further you went, the more treacherous it became. People had disappeared in there before. Some bodies were recovered, others never were. I hoped this wouldn't be one of those cases. We met the divers group at the entrance. They told us he had been there 1 minute and gone the next. They searched for a while, but there was no trace of him. That's when they called for help. My team suited up and entered the water immediately. We split into 2 groups. One would start from the beginning, following the group's route, while the others would start from the end and work their way backwards. Eventually, we'd meet in the middle, then retrace our steps to make sure nothing was missed. I had been through this cave system before, and even though I was familiar with the layout, I knew better than to let my guard down. Even experienced divers could get turned around in here. As my partner and I descended, the walls of the caves narrowed, forcing us to move in a single file. The water was clear, but the deeper we went, the darker it became. My flashlight cut through the blackness, sweeping across the limestone walls, searching for any sign of the missing diver. We reached a turn in the cave, where the path sloped deeper. I decided to check the bottom, scanning for the sediment of any signs of movement or disturbance. And then I saw it. A large opening in the rock. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied. I'd never seen it before. The entrance was wide enough to swim through comfortably. The darkness beyond was absolute, my light failing to penetrate more than a few feet inside. I signaled my partner to follow. We moved into the tunnel slowly, our lights illuminating the rocks around us. The passage stretched further than I expected, winding deep into the cave system. Then my stomach clenched. A dive mask. It laid half buried in the sediment, its strap torn as if it had been ripped from someone's face. I didn't need to check the name on the side to know what that meant. If the missing diver had lost his mask in here, there was no way he made it out alive. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, and took a slow breath to steady myself. We had to keep moving. The tunnel continued for another minute before sloping upward. I could see the surface of the water above us, a thin, rippling mirror reflecting the beams of our flashlight. We broke through cautiously. The cave we surfaced in was massive. The air was thick and humid, the rocky walls slick with moisture. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, dripping water into the still pool we had emerged from. It was eerily quiet, except for the soft sound of water lapping against the rocks. Then I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed, uneven. Piles of debris were scattered across the cavern floor, forming large mounds of mud, sticks, and broken branches. I took a few steps closer, my boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. A nest. An alligator nest. I'd seen plenty before, but never this big. It was enormous, far larger than any I'd encountered in the wild. And then I saw the bones. They were everywhere. Some were old, sun-bleached and brittle, while others looked fresh. Too fresh. Among them were pieces of diving equipment. Masks, broken regulators, even a few tanks, corroded and rusted, but unmistakable. This wasn't just a nest. It was a feeding ground. My stomach twisted as I turned to my partner. We had to leave. Now. That's when I heard a sound in the water. I turned, my flashlight cutting across the pool. And there it was. At first, it looked like a dark shadow beneath the surface. Then it rose higher. The massive ridged head breaking the surface of the water. An alligator. And it was huge. Its head alone had to be 3 feet long, its body stretching well over 20 feet. It was just watching us, not moving, not attacking, just watching. Then slowly, it began to sink again, vanishing beneath the water like a ghost. We didn't wait. I spotted a tunnel leading out of the cavern. It was narrow, but only partially submerged. It was room enough to run through without needing to swim. I didn't know where it led, but I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't stay here. We took off down the passage, our boots splashing through the water. 50 feet in, I heard it, a loud splash behind us. Something was in the tunnel. Something big. I ran faster, my breath coming in short gasps. The tunnel twisted and turned, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I scanned for an exit. The sound of something moving closer through the water behind us was growing closer. Finally, I saw it. Light. An opening at the end of the tunnel. We sprinted towards it, lungs burning, legs aching. The second we reached the exit, we scrambled up onto solid ground, into a swampy clearing. I turned back, shining my light into the tunnel. Nothing. It was gone. We called for an extraction immediately. A team arrived not long after, picking us up and bringing us back to base. Later, an investigation team was sent back into the cave. They never found the alligator, but they did find the nest, and the remains of more than a few missing divers. That day, we were able to bring closure to several families, but for me, it was a reminder. There are things in this world that we aren't meant to disturb, and I would never swim in a cave system again.